welcome to The Fix. It is Monday the 17th of July and I'm delighted to be joined by the one and only Maya Goodfellow.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Problem? Yeah, good. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Easy. We haven't talked about it for a while. Brexit happening. So Brexit's back in the news because David Davis is going to negotiate with Michel Barnier. He doesn't have many papers. Michel Barnier's got lots of papers. You don't need papers. I have papers today, but I don't normally have papers, you know. And what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that remaining is entering the agenda again. Is people are starting to say out loud, maybe we don't have to leave the EU. I think that's mainly because of the Tories' weakness. So the election was called on the basis of, I want a big fat mandate to do a big, bad, hard Brexit. And she didn't quite get it. So now people are coming out and feeling more confident to say, hey, wait a minute, why do we have to listen to the result of the referendum? That's coming in the form of the usual suspects. So we've had Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair, Vince Cable. We've also had our first union leader saying, why do we have to leave? That was Manuel Cortés from the TSSA. Do you have any idea why the TSSA are the most Remain union when the RMT are the most Brexit union?
I mean, I think part of it is, I think Manuel Cortez is very pro-freedom of movement as well, so I think that he is not going to give in to the kind of the xenophobic agenda. I think he really opposes.
Do you know why? But why have you got one union that's super Lexit-y and one... I don't know, we don't know. Text us if you know why RMT are Lexit and the TSSA, they're two transport unions. One of them's the most Remain and one of them's the most Lexit. Who knows? So 2 examples. I'm going to talk about 2 articles. One which was saying we don't have to do Brexit. One which was saying we're going to have to do it even if it's looking pretty bad. So Gideon Rachman in the FT. One of the political commentators in the FT that talks a bit less shit than some of the other ones. He's worth reading and I like his podcast. Martin Wolf, also worth reading. And he doesn't have a podcast. Janan Ganesh, obviously, thick as pig shit. Which is what he called us, but what he turned out to be. So, Gideon Rachman's argument is that in the first referendum, we were told we can have our cake and eat it. If it becomes apparent that Brexit's a suboptimal idea, if it becomes apparent that either we're going to have a deal that was worse than before, so not much control, but exactly the same things that we have to give over, or exactly the same control that we have to forego. Obviously, the issue he points out is that the consequences of Brexit won't be immediately felt, and there's a 2-year time frame for Brexit. And will people realise Brexit means a poorer country in time? His response is that there's a big event which could happen, which would be if it looks like there's going to be no deal. I was thinking this looks at, so he's saying, if David Davis goes there and Europe are not budging at all, and then I suppose the whole establishment and all the newspapers would have to start suggesting that there's going to be a catastrophe because there's going to be no deal, we're going to go to WTO terms. Probably you get some sort of coalition of businesses and the newspapers and potentially some sort of cross-party consensus saying this is going to be a disaster, and that sort of feeds into public opinion, and then we get a groundswell of support for a second referendum. Do you see it happening?
I mean, we had that coalition. It happened in the referendum.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying it won't happen, but I do think that this idea that the same old people coming out saying we shouldn't leave the EU were the people saying it before and during the referendum. So I think that actually winning people over isn't perhaps not as easy as people think. I think people's living standards are likely to get worse, but I don't think that's all due to Brexit. Like, I think that will have a negative impact, but we're not talking about the systemic issues that existed before Brexit and that will exist after Brexit, if it happened. We're not talking about low productivity, we're not talking about bad jobs, we're not talking about low wages in the way that we should be. And I think that we're probably going to leave the European Union.
You think we're going to leave?
I think we probably will.
Would you back a second referendum?
I think it's really difficult to say. That's what's so frustrating about this conversation now, is the negotiations have just begun. People coming out now saying, well, it's going to be a disaster. Well, they said that before, and nothing's happened yet for us to debate. So I think it's a really difficult one to even have a kind of conclusion on yet, because nothing yet has happened. It looks like the Tories are going to be absolutely terrible at negotiating this. We kind of knew that if you look at the general election campaign. That could be a total disaster.
So John Harris's argument, which I think we're going to get up now, so the headline was Brexit is a terrible idea, but it has to happen. So he was saying Brexit is going to be economically catastrophic, but if we hold a second referendum, if we go against it now, that's going to allow for a groundswell of a particularly horrible politics to return. So he's saying the reason that migration wasn't such a heated issue in the most recent election, and the reason that UKIP have run out of steam, is because the question of freedom of movement seems like, it seems like freedom of movement's going to end. So he's saying that has taken the wind out of that movement's sails. And if, as you said, the coalition of businesses, newspapers, which we've seen before, comes together to say, we're going to go against your will, even if in a second referendum 52% of people say, let's actually not do Brexit, that is going to unleash a particularly horrible kind of politics. And he says the only reason we're going to have to get rid of what he calls like post-imperial English exceptionalism is to try going on our own and letting it fail. So he's got the argument is like, we might go back in at some point and we might rescue ourselves after learning that on our own it's a disaster. I'll be a very old man. It's an interesting argument. Do you feel closer to that one?
No, because I also think with that argument, I think this idea that things get bad and then therefore people change their minds, or people begin to realise that this was some kind of cry of imperial nostalgia. That's not really the way it works. People need to be we need to unpick that and really confront it. That doesn't just happen.
What would that look like?
Well, I mean that is
sorry, big question.
That's talking about a proper education about these things, right? People really understanding what it is to be British, changing that definition of Britishness. That's not happening with leaving the EU. I think there's a lot of assumptions here from a lot of people, a lot of commentators about what Brexit will be and what it will mean. But these things don't just happen because we're leaving the EU. They have to be put in motion. I think what we're seeing now simply is just a lot of commentators making kind of quite ill-informed comment about something that is very difficult to make well-informed comment about because it hasn't happened yet. And as it unfolds, I think we can begin to critique it better. But right now, we've just got pictures of David Davis sitting at a table with no papers.
So you think wait and see? Should there? So if you're, I think you sound like you're like me. So you feel like we're probably going to leave. Let's try and make it soft and as least racist as possible. Whereas, say, someone like Alistair Campbell or Vince Cable is pretty obsessed with we want Remain. So what we're trying to do now is lay the foundations for an argument in a year's time or 9 months' time where we can say this is a disaster. Let's try again. But is there any ground you feel like you're trying to set or make room for?
Well, I think that that's all well and good for them to try and lay that ground, but I think they do it in the wrong way because I think they are seen as the elite, whether that's fair or not is another debate. Yeah, well,
they are.
Okay, fine. Yeah, but the point is that I don't know who that wins over. I think there's an argument to be had about what we say about freedom of movement and what we say about immigration. I don't think that's being made particularly well right now. I think it is on racist terms. I think it's incredibly xenophobic. And this idea that immigration simply isn't being talked about because people think freedom of movement is going to end. Well, if that is the case, that's not going to continue. And I think we need to be reckoning with that. So that's what I am concerned about. I am concerned about having that conversation that hasn't been had for 60, 70 years in the UK.
That makes a lot of sense. So, sorry, I mean, everything you say makes a lot of sense. I'm just saying I've made a particular sense of that. That the argument we're hearing at the moment is very much all the things you said you hated during the referendum are bad. Migration is bad. The European Court of Justice is bad. But the alternative is so catastrophic economically that you're going to have to be resigned to those things which are bad. Which is kind of a Tina argument. There is no alternative. And it's a bit like what they did to Syriza in Greece, which is to say, well, yeah, austerity is kind of bad, but what are you going to do? Have the deepest recession of any European country in a few decades? Ha, probably not. So you have to keep the status quo. So, yeah, I think that makes a lot more sense of what is a better ground to make, which isn't to say we have to remain because there's no alternative, but to sort of try and challenge some of the more reactionary motives that led to Brexit in the first place.
And I also think on that's where Alistair Campbell and co kind of fall short, is that they love the EU. Right? They're really committed to the EU, and that's their stance to take. But a lot of people, including people like myself who voted Remain, were actually incredibly sceptical of the EU and found there were huge problems with it, and there remain to be huge problems with it. And I think that without dealing with that and without confronting that, and with continuing to make this kind of argument that leaving is a disaster and the EU is essentially positive in every way, is not going to win people over if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, Alistair Campbell sort of loves the EU for exactly the same reason that most people who voted Brexit absolutely hate it. So he's probably not going to be the right person to send that message. We're going to move on to our next story. Maya's going to introduce the abuse debate that has been taking place or gained particular traction over the last week. First of all, we're going to look at Diane Abbott discuss the abuse she faces on a daily basis. Quite a harrowing and powerful speech.
We are talking about mindless abuse. And in my case, the mindless abuse has been characteristically racist and sexist. And just to outline, I've had death threats. I've had people tweeting that I should be hung if quotes, they could find a tree big enough to take the fat bitch's weight. There was an EDL-affiliated Twitter account, hashtag burn Diane Abbott. I've had rape threats described as a pathetic, useless, fat, black piece of shit, ugly, fat, black bitch, and nigger. Nigger over and over again. And one of my members of staff said that when people ask her, what is the most surprising thing about coming to work for me? The most surprising thing for her is how often she has to read the word nigger. And this comes in through emails, through Twitter, through Facebook. I think the rise in the use of online has turbocharged abuse. Because, 30 years ago, when I first became an MP, if you wanted to attack an MP, you had to write a letter, usually in green ink, you had to put it in an envelope, you had to put a stamp on it, and you had to walk to the post box. Now they press a button and you read vile abuse, which 30 years ago people would have been frightened to even write down.
So as we've just seen from that really, as Michael said, harrowing video of Diane Abbott speaking about the online abuse that she has experienced, we can see that this is a very real problem, and I don't think it's a particularly new problem. But what we want to talk about now is how and why it's gained salience in recent weeks, because this has become something that's been discussed a lot, talking about the left particularly and online abuse. So we can kind of trace this back, and we see a couple of weeks ago there was a story about Luciana Berger that she had been threatened with deselection by people in her CLP. And it kind of transpired when you unpick this story apart that it was actually one person from the CLP executive who had asked her to apologise for not supporting Jeremy Corbyn, and the rest of the CLP then distanced themselves from those very comments. And that was followed quite shortly after that by a speech from Yvette Cooper at Fabian Society, and she was talking a lot about the abuse people experience across the board. But what we've seen since then really is this idea that abuse is particularly specific to the left, and particularly misogynistic abuse is something that people on the left are perpetrating time and again. So this is centred often around men, and there's been a spotlight put on this in the Daily Mail, The Sun, but also from other reputable papers talking about how the left has a problem with abuse. And I think that what this does actually is that it totally misses the point, and intentionally misses the point, because it's trying to suggest that abuse isn't something that's across the political spectrum, but that it is a product of left-wing politics. And I think what this does is it minimises the abuse that people experience, and also kind of castigates the left. It holds up the left as problematic, as inherently problematic. I mean, what do you think about this?
I think, I obviously totally agree with that abuse exists. And popular politics is in like mass engagement in politics, plus Twitter, plus racism and misogyny creates quite a large amount of abuse. And I genuinely feel for all the people in public life, especially women in public life, or people in colour in public life. I mean, maybe if I had more Twitter followers, people would attack me for being gay, but I don't get that yet. And I think we should call that out, and I think we need to think about how we can relieve the burden that people face in having all those horrible messages being sent to them. But I totally agree that we have to disentangle abuse from political opposition and not allow the two to be merged. And I think for both reasons. So I think the people who like abuse and political opposition to be merged are, one, abusers, because if you're a sexist misogynist, there's nothing better than hiding behind the righteousness of a political struggle if actually what you want to do is abuse women and brown people and gay people. And elites who are terrified of popular politics and don't like the fact that ordinary people are starting to speak out against them and potentially feel quite angry at the extent to which they've been fucked over by an elite. And so they want to tarnish popular politics and empowered public with a small minority who are racist, misogynist, abusive people.
Yeah, and I think this point's really important. Everything has to be prefaced with this. It does exist. I experience a lot of abuse, namely from the far right.
Do you get left abuse? Do you get abuse from lefties?
Yeah, but not in the way that not significantly. Yeah. No.
Well, you're not a centrist, though, right?
No. So I think that is where I'm positioned and what I talk about, because I talk a lot about migration.
Of course.
So I think that brings a lot of far right abuse. But I think in terms of, so once that's been established, abuse is an issue. It's an issue on the left as well as the rest of the political spectrum. I wouldn't deny that. But once we have established that, I think we need to look at the way that that's being used to talk about the Labour Party, and particularly a Labour Party that has moved to the left. And I think it functions in two ways. So one, we have this idea that the left is more misogynistic than any other part of the political spectrum. So we had one person tweet yesterday, I think it was, saying modern Labour is the most misogynistic political force in the UK.
I think that was Chris Deering.
Let me tell you that is an absurd thing to say. Not only does that minimise the misogyny the rest of us experience from people who aren't within the Labour Party, it totally conflates party politics with something that is structural, that is within society. And I think this suggestion is totally ludicrous, and people are what they're doing there is kind of using feminism for their own gain, right? To make their own political point. And I think that really needs to be shut down now, because it's so disingenuous. But the other thing that I think it does, and this is something that it hasn't just happened in recent weeks. We saw this last summer. We saw this when Jeremy Corbyn first of the leadership election. A lot of his supporters were talked about as like rabid kind of trots who were always attacking Labour MPs. I mean, I've been a member of the Labour Party for quite a while, voted Jeremy Corbyn both times, have never engaged in any of this kind of abuse. So, but I'm lumped in with this category of like you say, a really small minority of people. And I think what people are trying to do there is shut down the idea of democratising the Labour Party. So this idea that we're too stupid, we're going to elect someone who's not electable, but then also that we treat other people with total disdain, is an attempt to actually say these people can't be trusted with any kind of power. And what's really interesting is if you look at the way like Blair and the Tories are talked about, when they do or did things that are quite callous and kind of political manoeuvring, it's called ruthless but clever politics. They've got a handle on power and they can control what's going on. When the left try to do anything about taking the leaves of the Labour Party and the reins of the Labour Party, they're kind of all smeared as people who are kind of engaging with really, really nasty politics. And time and again the retort of, I thought this was supposed to be kind of gentler politics, is always used against us. And I think it's really actually about trying to shut down that debate on the left.
Well, because there's sort of people from, I think it was a Tory MP, I wish I'd written down which one it was, but he was talking about how the atmosphere was a bit hostile in the 2017 election. He said, I thought elections were all you go for it, and then you go for a pub afterwards and you have a little bit of a joke about how it all was. And it's sort of like, this isn't the Oxford Union anymore. Like, this does matter to people. People are passionate about who wins the election because lives are at stake. And yes, that doesn't mean you should be abusive, but you are going to face the anger of lots of people if you decide to be a Tory MP or a Labour MP who's standing in the way of a party that could actually challenge the injustices that people care about. Not that I think that should ever legitimate abuse, but popular politics is going to come with criticism, and that's not a reason to get rid of popular politics. We love popular politics at Novara. That's the whole point. Should we get Dawn on?
Yep.
We're going to get Dawn Foster on, the fabulous Dawn Foster. We're going to talk about housing in the context of Grenfell. I think, first of all, we're going to show you, you've probably seen it before, but it's the most important video we've ever made here at Novara. It's the fundraising video. See you in 1 minute? I don't know how long it is.
Over the last 10 years, things have really changed.
Victory for real people. Us. It's about us.
But for all of the darkness, every cause has an effect.
40 students on the roof of Millbank.
For all the talk of change, the present moment is really one of crisis.
A crisis of democratic representation.
Of identity.
A climate crisis.
Of a failing economic model which isn't working for most people.
We can't have a media that's beholden to advertisers or the political ambitions of oligarchs.
Which is why, in 2013, we founded Novara Media.
Unlike corporate media, we are funded by our subscribers.
There's no tax avoiders, there's no oil money, and there's no lords. What we're creating is media for you, which quite simply, you make possible.
We're looking to raise £40,000. That will allow us to not only keep on paying our contributors, but give them a little bit more, as well as keep our studio and take our fantastic Novara events nationwide.
To help us get there, go to support.novaramedia.com. and give a one-off donation, or even better, sign up for a subscription.
We've already achieved so much, but the truth is, we've barely started.
Yep, we're back on. I just need to concentrate when the countdown is happening. I'm learning. I feel like I'm kind of doing a media studies BTEC and I'm just entering second year. It's an iterative process. Anyway, welcome Dawn Foster.
Hi.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
How are you?
I'm good. I've had a good weekend. How about you?
My weekend was kind of... I didn't do that much this weekend because I was like, I'm not going to do that much because I want to do like a bit of research, maybe write something, and then obviously sort of like, I just sat around.
You should have gone to Lambeth Country
Oh,
Fair.
I should have gone to Lambeth Country
Seen the
Fair.
communist ducks. Communist ducks, amazing.
Communist what?
Communist ducks. Ducks are communist.
What
and
makes
dogs.
ducks communist?
They all run around together and they work together as a team.
Oh, isn't nature lovely?
Yeah.
We're gonna get on to serious business. We've talked a lot about, so what we're going to talk about basically is housing in the context of Grenfell. So I want us to update a little bit on the situation with where we are with Grenfell. We've been on this show asking lots of questions. Was the cladding illegal? Who's responsible? Who's to blame? Etc. 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 I feel like many people in many of our viewers, myself included, because I watched the show as well, we still don't have the answers to those questions. Then we're going to talk a bit about sort of like the future of housing, what we should be demanding, and then we're going to talk a bit about labour councils, a subject we like to talk about on Novara. So yeah, in terms of Grenfell, could you give us a bit of an update? So I mean, and answer some of those questions. So was the cladding illegal?
Yeah.
Has anyone taken responsibility? Does it look like justice might come? Sort of an update on what you think the most significant development.
So at the moment, most of the families, both of those who lost people, but also the people who escaped the tower, the people who live nearby who were evacuated, the immediate locals, what they're focusing on now is the so-called terms of reference for the inquiry. So basically trying to broaden them out, because obviously when the appointed judge came out and said this is what we're going to focus on, they were very, very upset by how narrow it was. Everyone I've spoken to is extraordinarily angry about what happened, but equally doesn't want this just to be about what decisions were made at Grenfell, but more about how we stop those decisions being made again, how we make sure that local authorities, landlords are properly accountable to residents, and also that before these things happen, people have legal recourse to justice. Because one of the problems was, I mean, it was initially reported as a problem of legal aid, but the problem was that you couldn't get legal aid for this because you didn't even have the legal route to go and try and take your landlord to court over, safety issues. And I think the problem is it's so complex, and this is why there's so much kind of conflict of information. So Philip Hammond comes out and says actually the cladding was illegal, when everybody I've spoken to said problem is that for every building regulation that you think is broken, you can find another rule. So basically what Philip Hammond referred to was a part of the recommendations that said it shouldn't be used on towers over, I think, 120. Grenfell was 220. So it's recommended...
Feet, metres or...
Meters.
Okay, yeah.
I think he said 180 feet and the tower is 220 metres. I think they're different.
Yeah.
I
was looking at the floors before.
Post-Brexit, we'll all be back on the
Yeah.
But obviously that was a recommendation. They installed fire breaks they thought could help. But, the problem is a lot of these tests are done on desktops, etc. So it becomes really, really complex. Everyone I've spoken to says that you can constantly find conflicting information. And also in 2012, David Cameron's bonfire of red tape, which now looks horrific in context of Grenfell literally being a bonfire, had a lot of the building regulations on tall buildings scrapped. And in a debate last week in Parliament, a lot of people, including some Tories, so David Amos was, Amos, the brass-eyed cake man, he was very, very critical of the fact that during Cameron and Osborne's reign, they had a 1 in, 2 out policy on regulations. And a lot of them were about fire regulations. So obviously, you know, and the Tories themselves were complaining that there had been this Tory culture from the top down that basically said that the only reason the housing crisis existed was because they were too constrained, when actually what happens is we make things unbelievably unsafe. We look at Camden being evacuated. We look at today, a lot of towers have taken the cladding from the outside, and now they're worried that that has made things even more dangerous, because all it takes is a match and then, you know, the flammable insulation will go up. So it's all over the place at the moment. There's a meeting for residents tomorrow night to speak to the response team, and at the moment most residents aren't getting the help they need. It's very, you know, they're very, very confused about where they go to get help. There's a huge question about how much money has been donated and how little of that has gotten to the families as well. Yeah,
I mean, like a charity thing, you know, there was so many sort of charitable things that emerged after the event, when it wasn't clear that that was what the event demanded.
I think it's really key. I mean, I did a Spectator podcast with a writer who lived in Notting Hill, and he said that he felt that Grenfell showed that the big society worked, we didn't need the state, because in his words, the middle classes came in and sorted things out. When on the ground, all I saw, you know, on the night, there were just working class people all around. Most of the people I spoke to who were helping with donations, who were helping people, were working class, and they were local or they came further afield. But he said that it showed that charity will come in and help. When actually what's happened is there has been a huge charitable response, but the problem is that the state failed to provide. So the state was supposed to have emergency planning in place, failed abysmally, completely. Nothing that Kensington and Chelsea did helped the survivors and just prolonged, you know, all of their issues. And now we have a problem where, you know, a family today needs an electric wheelchair. We know that there are several in storage units, and they can't get them because it's so difficult to get access to what's in the storage units. Getting the money is really, really difficult. So charity comes in, but it's really uncoordinated, and nobody can properly link things up because they don't have the state apparatus there.
I'm still just shocked by that statement, because I mean, even if the council had come in and the big society had just sort of complemented that, I mean, a building burning down very quickly and killing 80+ people because of a lack of regulations, how in any way you can use that as an example of how the big society works.
Surely
and the big society is a small state.
Trained in fire safety.
Yeah, but even however nice the middle class people are, we don't want them to just like give people clothes after the building burns down. We don't want the building to burn down. I wanted to just in terms of the cladding. So my understanding was the reason it's ambiguous as to whether it's illegal or not is that the law is somewhat functional. So it's sort of like, if you can, we don't say X material is illegal and X material is legal. We say, if you can show that your building is this amount not combustible, you can do it.
So it's all about recommendations, and so if you have combustible cladding, you can install fire breaks, etc., and then you can do a desktop study to prove that that is the case. But the problem is that, as we see with Grenfell, as we've seen with Lakanal House, desktop studies don't always work because they're on a desktop, they aren't on the outside of a building. And obviously the residents were told initially that they would have zinc oxide panels on the outside. That changed at some point. I haven't managed to track down when and if the residents were informed yet, but at some point the cost of the refurbishment would have been much higher. Either the TMO and the council decided to make it lower, and that's when the flammable cladding came in.
Yeah, I think Maya's going to ask a question about the future. I just want to ask one last question about this specific Grenfell thing, which is, all the cladding's come back, they've tested it, and 100% has failed. How does that relate to the regulations that were before? If 100% of the cladding is failing now, would it have failed then, or have we changed the standards?
Basically, I think the issue is that, as you said, if you want to clad a building, you have to prove that it's a certain amount non-combustible, so that if there is a fire, like it wouldn't spread entirely very, very quickly. But the problem is, but the government are testing it very, very differently. So the government are trying to see if the panels will combust at all, and obviously most of them will, because they're very, very cheap. And the panels that don't combust are heavier, they're more expensive, they're often harder to fit. So obviously the problem is that we have cost cutting, we've got less red tape, so people are much happier to choose the cheapest cladding possible, install it with the cheapest possible provider. And quite a few of the developers who install this, have been subject to some fraud investigations because they are very, very cheap. They cut corners. And one of the things that Grenfell Tower residents talked about was that they were bullied and harassed by the developers repeatedly. So they had letters, legal letters threatening. They said that some of the contractors were very aggressive and abusive with them. And, you know, this is just what happens when you try and cut costs constantly.
Yeah. I mean, on that, I suppose, what do you think needs to change? Like, what needs to happen? I suppose both in terms of housing, but also this issue kind of spoke to the fact that this guy assumed the big society was middle-class people. But, like, actually that speaks to, you know, residents who are ignored. The fact that it was largely migrants, like, people of colour, working-class people. Like, these are people on the margins of society too. So I'm wondering what you think needs to happen in terms of changes in housing, but also does that need to occur in a broader way in society in terms of how we're treating people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big issues is that they were ignored over and over again. So I spoke to the former head of the Resident Association, and he's a white, quite well-spoken, professional middle-class man, and even he couldn't get his voice heard. He, you know, he headed up, he gave speeches, he pressed for an inquiry into the renovation over and over again, moved out a couple of months before the fire, and you know, everybody in the tower said they felt ignored because they were a symbol of a Notting Hill that was past. So you know, I spoke to one woman who said that she moved into the area, she moved onto that estate because at that time nobody else would live there. And she said the reason it's become so vibrant and so exciting and so expensive is because they made it good. So the people who lived there when nobody else wanted to, the people who worked really hard, the people who've helped with Carnival, you know, those are the people who are now being told that they should leave because the area has, you know, gone from being up and coming to like an oligarch's den. So I think that we really do need to make councils much more accountable because they really aren't at the moment. There are so many councils just running completely roughshod over residents' concerns, ignoring people they're supposed to represent. And at the moment, residents can't really do anything. They can complain over and over again, but things happen regardless. And you know, legal aid's been cut, so even if they could get take this to court, they often can't. There have been a few cases of judicial reviews against some of these housing problems, especially in Lambeth, but they're few and far between, and the council will appeal with expensive lawyers over and over again. So I think we really do need to.
What would that be? So for me, that idea of a judicial review, who's judicially reviewing what? Just unpack that a bit, because I'm a bit like.
So a judge is looking at whether or not the decisions that were made are legal.
And that would be the decision to redevelop X area and kick out kick out 100 or so people, and then they say this is illegal. It contravenes our right to housing.
Yes. So that's what happened with Cressingham Gardens. They won a judicial review. The judicial review found in their favour. Lambeth will appeal it, etc. So that's one thing.
But that's generally just a stalling measure, right?
I think the other thing is that we need to look at how we build houses. So one of the big problems is that we used to do it on a mass scale. We used to do it, and and when these homes were made, when tower blocks were built, when a lot of the estates were made. I live in a 1930s council estate in Clapham, and it's absolutely amazing. It's really built for families. Like they're wonderful homes, and everybody there loves it. It's got a great sense of community. And when people moved in, they absolutely loved them. And then councils, when it allowed them to fall into managed decline. And now when we come to renovate, we go for the cheapest possible option. So it's the same as with PFI in hospitals and PFI in school buildings. You go for the cheapest possible thing, you go through a massive supply chain, so it's really, really expensive. When actually what you could do is, train up local people to fill the construction skills shortage gap. And if you make proper social housing, then the housing benefit goes back to the council to be reinvested instead of going to a private landlord's pocket.
I mean, it's a really easy political argument to make. It's one I made a lot, like, on the doorstep in the election campaign, which is just like, if at the moment all this public money and all this private money, like all your earnings are going to some landlord who doesn't do anything and doesn't look after your house, if you get the council to build the housing, that's income for the council. Also, that's because there's like, but no one wants to live in council housing. It's like that was intentional. So they,
also, when I speak to people, I say, would you rather rent privately, or if money was no object, would you rather rent privately or own your own home? And almost everyone says, I would like to own my own home because private renting is hell. If you say to them, if money was no object, would you like to live in a council with a council tenancy, private rent, or own your own home? A lot more people say, actually, I'd quite like to go to the council, because a lot of people don't want to stay in an area forever. A lot of people don't want to be in charge of like whether or not their walls falling down or the plumbing's screwed up or anything like that. So a lot of people would really like to live in like secure council accommodation, and they can't because it isn't there, and also because it's been stigmatised and deliberately run down.
Well, I mean, I think that's that was the point, right? So council housing used to be just something that everyone did, and then there was a specific political project to make anyone who could leave. Yeah. So it's sort of like, if you can buy up your council house and sell it, why not leave?
Yeah. But also, if you look at the English Housing Survey, the worst accommodation is private rented accommodation, and some privately owned homes. So council accommodation on the whole is very, very good, you know, because it was built to last. It was built to last for a very long time, and it's looked after by the people who live in it because they're quite happy in it. But private rented accommodation, often it's very, very poor. The cheaper it is, you know, and you know, if you're migrants, if you're young people, then people just let it run down, because if you complain about something, they can kick you out. You know,
you're lucky to be there anyway.
Exactly.
And in terms of, so there's been quite a lot of reporting of like bad things Labour councils are doing in terms of housing, and I think that brings a problem given that it's kind of a rejuvenation of the left in the form of the Labour Party. There's an obvious tension there between what perhaps the leadership of the Labour Party stand for and then what's going on at council level. And I wonder whether are there any positive examples of councils doing the right thing or doing a more positive thing?
There definitely are. I mean, obviously, like Haringey, Lambeth, Southwark, worst of the worst. So, I mean, Islington about 2 weeks ago won a court case. So Islington have a housing policy where if you want to build a development in Islington, you have to have at least 50% affordable housing.
Wow.
But the policy says, but ideally it's as much as possible. And so one development kept trying to come in with none, and then went up to 10% after 3 court battles, and in the end the court found in favour of Islington and it's not going ahead. And then you have Sheffield. So Sheffield are, you know, it is a partnership, but they are building new affordable homes for people, quite a few. Sheffield are also doing a Housing First scheme, so that's a Finnish scheme that's almost ended homelessness there, where when you have somebody who is street homeless, you put them in a house and then you give them services afterwards, whereas normally homeless people are put in hostels, they're told they have to get clean, etc. And Liverpool are doing that as well. So both Liverpool and Sheffield are both doing the Housing First scheme, which will massively help homelessness. And Liverpool, you know, Liverpool have been cut more than almost any other council in the UK. They're really, really hard up, but they're working really, really hard to actually keep open libraries, keep open, you know, domestic abuse services. And obviously, they've been trying to do stuff like the Granby 4 Streets project, which won the Turner Prize, where they basically got 4 empty rundown streets with a housing association and this kind of art group called Assemble. They managed to redevelop them, get locals in, and make much more communal space. So you go there now, it looks great, it used to look terrible, and they've got, you know, streets for kids to play on and big signs saying "ball games please" everywhere.
Oh, that's amazing.
So there are some who do very, very good things. But unfortunately, the rogue kind of, you know, Labour right sort of councils are really, really kind of ruining it for people. And I think that's a big question for the leadership. I think the leadership have to put their foot down and say, this is our housing policy, because it's always housing. It's always housing. This is our housing policy. You can't keep trying to drive people out. You can't keep, you know, pushing people out. There's also, with Labour, Southwark, you know, with Lambeth, Southwark and Haringey, eventually they're going to push out Labour voters, and then they'll just kind of...
Well, so to make it a bit sort of like clearer for me, like what a good council does and what a bad council does. So say someone like Lambeth, Haringey or Southwark, what they say is, we as a council don't have the resources to build our own council housing. That means the only way we can get these buildings built is if we attract a private developer to build it for us. And the only way we can get the private developer to build it for us is if we let them build it with a minimal amount of social housing.
Or instead you could get a housing association on board, and you know, a housing association has built loads and loads of housing. They're always looking for land. So if you just work with the housing association instead of the private developer, a lot of housing associations aren't great, but equally, you know, you can force them to put in more affordable housing. Some of the housing that Islington do is incredible, but if other people can manage it, you can. And I mean, if you look at Southwark, you know, Southwark's saying that the only way they could redevelop it was by getting in a private developer, and it's like, when you actually look at the accounts, they completely shortchanged themselves. So they basically just handed us profit to Lend-Lease and impoverished themselves.
Yeah, it's bizarre because it's like you've got that amount of land. So the Haygate's a particular estate in sort of central Southwark by Elephant and Castle, and the land, I'm sure, is like, the land must be worth so much. Central London, huge, and they were like, oh, no one wants it, we're going to have to give it to Lend-Lease for nothing. which is like a private company who made it all into luxury flats after evicting. I don't know how many people lived on the Haygate estate, but a lot, right? In the hundreds. Yeah. So it just seemed. Is it corruption? I mean, what's going? Why, if there is an option, are these councils doing the wrong thing?
I think some of it is a disdain for social housing. Some of it is wanting to change the area. I mean, I was on a bus with a Newham councillor once, and he said to me, "Oh, what do you think the council should be doing, to help people?" And I said, "Building social housing." And he said, "Oh no, if you do that, you just attract undesirables." And and that's the most extreme and open argument I've heard. Yeah. But often when I speak to councillors and ask them why they're doing what they're doing, they speak in very, very couched words. Yeah. But when you get down to it, they all basically believe that social housing is a kind of is a magnet for the kind of people that they don't want to attract. They have disdain for it. They don't really like going on it, and they like to kind of talk about how much kind of antisocial behaviour there is on there. Yeah. It's like, well, you're also closing youth clubs, and do you honestly think that there's no crime going on behind the doors on a £5 million house street? But
I'm going to do my Labour rabble-rousing, which is, if you want councillors who aren't this fucked up, you need to go to your Labour Party meetings and your ward meetings and try and select some councillors who aren't fucking assholes.
I'm gutted now because I have an amazing councillor, and I'm in Lambeth. Oh, do you have? And she's now been elected to Batsy MP. So.
Oh, Marsha de Cordova. Yeah, she's one of my faves.
So now we're going to have to get a new councillor next year.
Oh, so go to the selection meeting and make sure it's a good one. We'll do one more question each, then we'll probably finish.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, do you think? So obviously, you're on TV a lot more talking about housing. There's a lot more demand for people talking about what's wrong with housing, given the catastrophe, the tragedy, the crime at Grenfell. Do you see anything positive coming out of this in terms of re-establishing social housing as something positive and housing as a human right? Or do you think it's going to wither away and we're basically going to get left with the status quo?
I think it definitely is. I think the kind of people who are talking to me about the need for social housing are very, very different to the people who were before. I think more and more people are upset about this. I think more and more people are now aware of a lot of the very, very damaging housing policies. So, for instance, I mean, I remember, like, early on the night of the fire when I was there, I remember tweeting that we had to make sure that the people who were made homeless by the fire were housed locally and permanently. And then I had to explain to a lot of people about how a lot of councils now were doing out of borough placements. So when you when you go to the council, they have a duty to house you, and often what they say is, okay, you've come to us in Kensington, we will Westminster are particularly bad for this, and so in Newham, we will house you, but it will be in Birmingham, and either you get your kids, move them to Birmingham, move them away from your support network, move them away from your job. And if you say no, they then say, we have offered you housing and you have rejected it, so we will discharge our duty, at which point you have no hope whatsoever. So you are homeless.
You're intentionally homeless at that point, so it's your own fault if you and your family are on the streets. And that's why so many
people just accept it.
Yeah.
So Birmingham Council have now said that they are having to move other people out because all of these people from London have come in. There's nowhere for them to house people in Birmingham, so it'll just go on forever. And I think a lot of people didn't realise that was the case. A lot of people didn't realise just how bad the managed decline of council estates was, and a lot of people are kind of realising exactly what a social good is. So hearing about the jobs that people had in Grenfell Tower, there was a teaching assistant who died, and all the kids were really upset. But you can't run a city, you can't even run a borough without people of all income levels. So the problem is we pay nurses absolutely nothing. We pay cleaners
overpaid, according to Philip Hammond, who earned 10k, who earns, as we speak, 10k a month on his townhouse in some posh part of West London. I can't remember which one it is.
Well, that's another irony, the fact that kind of over 50% of Tories, Tory MPs are landlords, and yet are still allowed to, set housing policy without any issue. So I think, you need to have cleaners and nurses and teachers able to afford to live in the city. Otherwise, the city won't function. I mean, if you go to Oxford, Oxford basically costs the same as London, but people are paid a little bit less, and they're now struggling to fill their schools because teachers on starting salaries can't afford to live there. So either a teacher commutes in and it costs a lot of money, or they just don't go to Oxford for a job.
Yeah.
So whenever I see my friends, they all say that the class sizes are going up, the head teachers are tearing their hair out because they can't get them in. The hospitals are really struggling as well, and this is what happens. You need to have a city that works for everybody, and you can't just instead complain that people in social housing are paying less rent than you. All you need to do instead is say, why is my house so expensive? Why am I paying so much money for my landlord? Everybody's rent should be affordable. You shouldn't just say, well, if I pay this amount of money, everybody should also be struggling. It's like we need to punch up, not down. But
we've got to make that into a shareable. I'm inspired on Maya.
Yeah, I suppose. What do you think the kind of balance is between national and local government in terms of the solution? Like, where, because there's a lot of problems coming from national, but also from local. What is the kind of balance?
I think it's definitely top down. I think that we would definitely. Part of it is that Labour would very, very happy to let house prices rise over and over again. The Pathfinder initiative in the north, where Labour basically demolished and evicted a load of people because they said the housing wasn't worth anything, really devastated a lot of communities. Yeah. It's very, very complex and worth looking into, but it is a crime. Owen Hathley is very, very good on the terrible kind of legacy of Pathfinder. So Labour weren't great. They didn't build. They were very happy for house prices to go up. And then the Tories came in, and they were just,
predictably a bit worse.
Yeah, funnily enough, they don't want to intervene on the housing crisis, because the answer is that they make less money. Because they're all landlords, they all have very expensive houses. Why would you do that? So I think that if you funded councils properly, then you would get more councils like Sheffield and Liverpool and Islington saying, we've got a bit of cash, we can actually house people. Because no council actually wants to have a huge number of people homeless, because homelessness is really, really expensive. So you have people in temporary accommodation, and it often costs the same per day to house a family as it would for like a week or a month in social housing. So if you gave councils the means to actually do things properly, but also beefed up laws so that they couldn't just get around the homelessness duty, etc., I think that would be a lot better. I think if you took off the financial pressure from a lot of councils, then the ones that are bad might be better, and the ones that are good at the moment could be brilliant.
Could be brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, there's hope, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to keep pushing for it. And every time someone says council tower blocks should be demolished, then we need to, we need to shout them down.
I think weirdly there's hope in terms of housing. There's hope because it's one of the things that's most clearly fucked. There's no with sort of like even income disparity. Someone can come with you the whole like, work needs to pay. Blah, blah, blah.
All you have is the 2% of people who are landlords who are happy. Yeah. And then you have, part of the reason the housing crisis is so big now is because suddenly middle class children are hit. Yeah. So a lot of people are having to remortgage their homes to even like help their kids with rent. And when they get to pensionable age and suddenly have no pension because they've remortgaged repeatedly, we're really going to be in trouble.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Dawn. Thank you so much, Maya. Join us on Thursday. Novara will be continuing the ideological war against landlords for as long as we can afford the rent in our studio. Then we'll probably be doing it in some sort of car park somewhere, or maybe we'll have to move to a different city when London becomes completely gated and the rents are completely ridiculous. Unless we build a political movement that can challenge landlords. Parasites. I mean, landlords as parasites. It's a complicated word to use in politics, but landlords are parasites. See you on Thursday. This was The Fix.
I really like Jerry Sprinter's thought for the day at the end.